German tank crews, hardened by years of battles across the vast Russian steppes and the fields of France, viewed themselves as nearly invincible within the steel armor of their machines. They were accustomed to Soviet anti-tank rifles bouncing harmlessly off their sloped plating and had grown used to shrugging off enemy artillery unless it struck with pinpoint accuracy, but their first encounter with the American bazooka shattered that confidence. To the Germans, the weapon appeared crude and almost laughably simple, a long, awkward tube carried on a single infantryman's shoulder. Many officers dismissed it as mere propaganda or a useless battlefield gimmick, yet when that tube launched its first shaped charge rocket, the illusion of safety inside a tank crumbled. By late 1943, reports from the Italian front reached German headquarters, detailing sudden tank losses seemingly caused by small groups of American soldiers hidden among ruins or mountain passes. Captured bazookas were studied by German engineers, who quickly recognized the threat of a portable weapon capable of piercing armor with a focused explosive jet. Initially, German propaganda downplayed its significance, calling it clumsy and inaccurate. But in truth, tank crews began whispering nervously about this new danger. They were trained to scan the horizon for enemy tanks and artillery. Now, a lone soldier, crouched in a ditch or doorway, could destroy their vehicle with a single shot. The impact was immediate and unsettling. In Normandy's hedgerow country, bazooka teams found perfect cover. German units, used to maneuvering in open terrain, suddenly found themselves vulnerable from all sides. Infantry squads armed with bazookas could appear at close range, fire, and vanish. German commanders noted that even when a bazooka failed to fully penetrate, the deafening blast and impact against the hull spread fear among crews, eroding their confidence. Veterans later recalled how even a near miss filled the fighting compartment with dread. The thought that the next rocket might strike true and turn their tank into a blazing coffin spread rapidly. Crews hesitated before entering towns, knowing threats could lurk around every corner. German infantry complained that armored units grew cautious. No longer charging with their former aggression, soldiers who once believed their armor made them untouchable realized they were being hunted by silent, unseen predators. Commanders issued new orders to avoid narrow streets, deploy infantry screens ahead of tanks, and preserve vehicles for larger battles. But morale was already slipping. The bazooka wasn't just a weapon of steel and explosives, it was a psychological tool, piercing confidence as effectively as it did armor. Captured German diaries from the period reveal a mix of disbelief and respect. One tank crewman described his first hit as a bolt from the blue. "We saw no gun, no tank, no artillery, just a sudden explosion that shook us. The machine that carried us through Russia was felled by a man with a tube on his shoulder." For those who prided themselves on technological superiority, this defeat stung deeply. To be brought down not by another mighty tank, but by a concealed infantryman was almost unthinkable. Yet across the front, more and more tanks were disabled by this odd American invention, forcing crews to accept that their days of dominance were numbered. By the summer of 1944, the fields and lanes of Normandy became graveyards for German armor. The bocage terrain was unlike anything German crews had faced before. Instead of wide plains allowing tanks to maneuver and spot threats from afar, it was a suffocating maze of earthen banks, dense hedges, and narrow paths. For American infantry, it was ideal hunting ground. For German panzer crews, it was a nightmare. The bazooka, already proven in Italy, found its deadly calling amid these claustrophobic green walls. Every hedge held potential danger. A tank creeping along a tight lane knew that at any moment, a flash of fire could erupt from the foliage. Bazooka teams, often just pairs of infantrymen, waited silently until a tank's flank or rear was exposed, then fired at point-blank range for the crew inside. There was no warning, just the sudden roar of impact, a jarring explosion, and the smell of scorched paint and fuel. Survivors spoke of the helplessness of being trapped in a steel coffin, unable to maneuver or strike back at an unseen enemy. Commanders tried to adapt, sending infantry screens ahead of their vehicles, but American teams showed patience, slipping past these escorts and striking when supporting infantry lagged behind. The bocage turned every village, every crossroads into an ambush zone. German soldiers bitterly wrote of the impossibility of advancing without losing tanks to invisible hunters. Even when they survived, the toll lingered. One lieutenant recalled how his crews grew paranoid. It felt like every embankment, every collapsed barn hit a rocket. In every shadow, we saw ghosts with bazookas. The impact on morale was devastating. German armored units were accustomed to leading assaults, smashing through enemy lines with raw power and firepower. Now, their commanders hesitated to commit vehicles without thorough reconnaissance. Once fearsome tanks inched forward, wary of what lay beyond the next hedge. This hesitation emboldened American troops. Infantry squads realized that with courage and a few bazookas, they could hold ground against machines that once inspired terror. The losses were staggering. Replacing tanks was no easy task, and each destroyed or abandoned vehicle weakened German defenses. Reports to Berlin spoke of unexpected losses and the shocking effectiveness of American rocket launchers. But among the ranks, rumors spread faster than official dispatches. Veterans from the Eastern Front said even the formidable Soviet anti-tank rifles didn't instill such unease. The bazooka's mobility, its sudden appearance at close range, and its ability to knock out even medium tanks made it a terror disproportionate to its size. Worst of all was the unpredictability. A tank could survive artillery barrages or duels with Shermans, only to be destroyed by two soldiers hiding with a tube. There was no glory in such a death, no clash of steel against steel. It felt dishonorable, humiliating, to be hunted like prey. Diaries and letters carried growing bitterness. Some crewmen called the bocage a slaughterhouse for armor. Others described Normandy as a place where the land itself fought us. For panzer crews, the bocage campaign marked the moment they began to fear not just American tanks, but the ingenuity and ruthlessness of American infantry armed with bazookas. By late 1944, German tankers faced not only infantry with bazookas, but an entire class of American vehicles designed for one purpose: hunting and destroying tanks. These were tank destroyers, machines with lighter armor than Shermans, but armed with powerful guns capable of piercing even the formidable Panther and Tiger tanks. At first, this concept seemed odd to German officers. Their doctrine held that tanks were built to fight other tanks. But the Americans invested in machines like the M10 Wolverine, M18 Hellcat, and M36 Jackson, sacrificing armor for speed and mobility. For German crews accustomed to frontal duels, these hunters posed a new threat, appearing suddenly on the battlefield and delivering lethal strikes with uncanny precision. Initial encounters with the M10 Wolverine caught many off guard. Its 76mm gun had enough range and penetrating power to punch through armor even from angles once thought safe. Crews reported being stunned by the ferocity of fire these machines could unleash. Taking up positions and firing before German tanks could react, the M18 Hellcat, with its astonishing speed, was even more daunting. It could race across open ground, flank heavier German tanks, and strike at their weaker sides or rear. Survivors described the Hellcat as a phantom, appearing where it seemed impossible, firing and vanishing before German guns could respond. Most shocking was the arrival of the M36 Jackson, armed with a 90mm gun. To crews, this weapon felt almost unfair. Stories circulated that the Jackson could penetrate the thick frontal armor of Tigers, a feat few other Allied weapons could achieve. German veterans later admitted that when they learned such machines were on the battlefield, their sense of superiority evaporated. They had always believed heavy tanks gave them an edge over the Allies. But this proved the Americans could field weapons that matched or surpassed German firepower. The tank destroyer battalions themselves were highly mobile. Shifting across the front to plug gaps or set ambushes, German officers bitterly complained that wherever they tried to launch a concentrated armored push, American tank destroyers were already waiting. Paired with bazooka teams, these units most damaging to morale was the growing sense that their technological edge was fading. They had built their reputation on the myth of superior engineering on tanks that rolled through Poland, France, and much of Russia. But now, in the battlefields of Western Europe, American ingenuity and mass production created specialized hunters that steadily dismantled that myth. The rise of tank destroyers marked not just a tactical shift but a collapse of confidence. German crews began to fear that every push would end not in victory but in fiery destruction at the hands of these swift American predators. The greatest shock for German tankers came not from bazookas or tank destroyers alone but from how the Americans paired them with standard Sherman tanks. The Sherman itself wasn't a particularly fearsome opponent to tank crews. German teams often mocked its thin armor and tendency to catch fire when hit, nicknaming it Tommy Cooker or Ronson after a lighter, convinced it could never match a Panther or Tiger in a head-on fight. But it wasn't the machine itself that worried them, it was how American forces used Shermans alongside specialized tank destroyers. In battle, Shermans advanced in large numbers, forcing German tanks to reveal their positions. Shermans didn't always win the firefight but could take losses, maneuver aggressively, and keep German gunners occupied. Then, while crews were focused on the approaching columns, American tank destroyers struck from the flanks. Hellcats and Jacksons used their speed to circle behind German lines, hitting weak spots with deadly accuracy. This choreography of combat was unlike anything the Germans had faced before. Instead of a solitary tank duel, it became a coordinated trap where Shermans served as bait and tank destroyers as executioners. German reports described the confusion and chaos that gripped tankers facing this tactic for the first time. Commanders, confident in their superior optics and gun range, suddenly found themselves encircled. Heavy armor built for frontal combat offered little protection against shots to the sides or rear. One Panther commander later admitted his crew quickly knocked out 3 Shermans in a row, only to be destroyed moments later by a Hellcat appearing from an unexpected angle. The realization that American tactics deliberately sacrificed weaker tanks to set up lethal ambushes stunned veterans accustomed to preserving every precious machine. The situation was worsened by the scale of American production. Shermans seemed endless, rolling across fields in numbers that dwarfed German reserves. Even if a crew took out 5 or 6 tanks in a skirmish, more always appeared. And behind those expendable Shermans lurked the real killers, tank destroyers, which Germans came to fear as much as Soviet T-34s. The psychological blow was immense. Crews began to understand that no matter how many enemy tanks they destroyed, winning the battle was impossible. For every tank lost, replacements were scarce. For every Sherman that burned, a new one arrived, often backed by the piercing crack of a Jackson's 90mm gun. Infantry coordination made things worse. American bazooka teams followed the armor, picking off German tanks that slipped through the initial waves. A tank surviving Shermans and evading tank destroyers could still be crippled by a hidden rocket team waiting at a crossroads. This layered anti-tank defense created a battlefield with no safe path forward. For soldiers encased in German armor, it felt like being caught in a tightening net. The Sherman was no longer a weak foe. It was part of a machine designed to crush even the most elite tank divisions. The cumulative effect shattered German confidence. They prided themselves on their mastery of armored warfare, the blitzkrieg that once swept through unopposed. But now, against the Americans, they faced a system that turned their strengths into weaknesses. Heavy armor became a burden on narrow roads. Long-barreled guns were useless in rear ambushes, and morale crumbled under the pressure of relentless Sherman waves backed by merciless tank destroyers. The myth of invincibility, carefully nurtured over years of war, was broken by the coordinated onslaught of American armor and anti-tank ingenuity. Some of the most vivid memories for German tankers were the sudden, brutal ambushes that obliterated entire tank columns in seconds. These encounters, often in the French countryside or Belgium's wooded paths, became legendary not for their scale but for the speed with which American anti-tank weapons demolished forces once thought unstoppable. For the Germans, it was more than a military defeat, it was a humiliation, a reminder that even the mightiest machines were vulnerable when caught in a trap. One report from northern France in autumn 1940 described a German column of Panthers and other tanks attempting to break through a narrow village road. The lead tank was hit point-blank by a bazooka team hidden in the rubble of a collapsed house. As the crew struggled to recover, tank destroyers positioned on a hill beyond the village opened fire. Within minutes, the road was blocked with burning wrecks. Survivors spoke of the horror of being trapped, unable to advance or retreat. Their vehicles were surrounded, with American gunners methodically picking them off. What made it worse was the silence before the ambush. There was no artillery preparation, no open field tank duel, just a sudden storm of fire from men and machines that had been invisible until then. In Belgium, another German unit moving through dense forest fell victim to a coordinated ambush involving bazooka teams and swift M18 HELCATS as the tanks crept forward. Bazooka crews disabled the rear vehicles, cutting off retreat. Then Hellcats surged from concealed positions, racing along hidden trails and striking from the flanks. Crews in the column's center recalled the panic as shells pierced their armor from unexpected directions. A single ambush wiped out what had been a proud armored battalion, leaving only charred remains smoldering in the forest gloom. Survivors abandoned their vehicles and fled on foot through the woods, haunted by the thought that they hadn't even landed a meaningful shot in return. These events crushed morale. Crews began openly saying the Americans fought like hunters, while the Germans had become prey. Stories spread quickly through the ranks. Soldiers awaiting orders to move forward feared not enemy tanks but the hidden bazooka in the shadows or the Hellcat appearing from nowhere. Veterans spoke of sleepless nights, listening for every snapped twig or engine hum, convinced it signaled another ambush. The effect was cumulative. Each destroyed column reinforced the sense that the battlefield was rigged against them. Commanders tried to adapt, sending scout patrols ahead of tanks, demanding infantry clear roads thoroughly, and banning movement through villages without heavy escorts, but the Americans adapted just as quickly, shifting ambush tactics and appearing where least expected. To German crews, it felt like the enemy could materialize from thin air. One sprouted tank divisions, symbols of shock and speed, now moved nervously, dreading the invisible foe lurking behind a hedge or grove. The psychological weight of these ambushes far outweighed the physical losses. Crews that once charged into battle with confidence began questioning every order, every maneuver. Diaries reveal growing despair. Tankers wrote of a sense of doom before the first shot was fired. For a generation raised on faith in German engineering and training, nothing was more crushing than realizing they were being undone not by superior tanks but by cunning traps and weapons exploiting their weaknesses. These ambushes became phantoms haunting every Panzer crew, shaping every decision and reminding them that in the new war of bazookas and tank destroyers, the hunters had become the hunted. In the winter of 1944, the Ardennes Offensive, known as the Battle of the Bulge, began. For many German tankers, it was a final grand gamble, a desperate bid to break Allied lines and force a negotiated peace. They surged forward, confident in their heavy armor, believing the snow-covered forests and narrow valleys of Belgium and Luxembourg would aid their surprise attack. At first, it seemed to work. Allied units fell back, roads clogged with retreating columns, and tanks once again poured through enemy lines. But the crews didn't anticipate the speed and adaptability of American counterattacks or the devastating role of bazookas and tank destroyers in halting the push. The Ardennes became a nightmare of visibility. Fog, snow, and thick woods concealed movement until it was too late. German crews, advancing along narrow roads, felt both sheltered and exposed, hidden from enemy air forces but blind to threats around them. Bazooka teams ruthlessly exploited this. Hiding behind snowbanks or in frozen farmhouses, they waited for tanks to pass, then struck from the rear at close range. Many German veterans later recalled the eerie quiet before an ambush, the muffled crunch of snow, the heavy exhaust of engines, then the sudden roar of a rocket tearing through steel. Crews, already chilled and exhausted, felt hunted in the very forests they thought would shield them. Even more terrifying were the American tank destroyer units rushed to the Ardennes. M18 Hellcats, with their legendary speed, seemed unfazed by snow and ice. They raced along backroads, outmaneuvering German armor stuck in traffic. M36 Jacksons with 90mm guns waited on ridges overlooking valleys where German tanks advanced in columns. In key strongholds like Bastogne, tank destroyers appeared at critical moments, knocking out Panthers and Tigers with stunning precision. Survivors described the horror of watching their tanks explode under fire from long range, realizing even a Tiger's thick armor wasn't immune on this frozen ground. The Americans used the terrain with ruthless skill. They set up roadblocks in narrow passes, combining mines, bazookas, and tank destroyers. German crews pushing through snowy villages found themselves pinned in tight streets, fired on from all sides by hidden guns. One tank division officer wrote bitterly after a clash, "We expected to fight Shermans in open fields. Instead, we fought ghosts in the woods, rockets in the shadows, and guns that destroyed our mightiest machines." The psychological strain during the offensive was immense. Crews spoke of sleepless nights in their frozen tanks, knowing dawn might bring another ambush. Once proud tank divisions, emblems of shock and momentum, stalled under relentless pressure. Even when they achieved local successes, constant bazooka and tank destroyer attacks eroded their confidence. The Americans, often outnumbered at the start, fought with a ferocity and ingenuity that stunned the Germans. By January 1945, as the offensive faltered, many tankers privately admitted they'd lost faith not only in victory but in the very machines they once revered. The Ardennes became a final, crushing reminder that the war's tide had turned. Surviving German crews carried memories of forests filled with hidden hunters, rockets striking from beneath snow, and tank destroyers whose guns sliced through their armor like paper. For those who saw their tanks as the pinnacle of military might, the Ardennes was a bitter revelation. The Americans had mastered the art of tank killing, and the era of German armor dominance was over. By the war's final months, fear of bazookas and tank destroyers so deeply rooted itself in German tankers' minds that it shaped every battlefield decision. What began as a technical threat became a psychological wound that never fully healed. Crews who once climbed into their tanks with a sense of invulnerability now did so with dread, nervously scanning every ruined house, every cluster of trees, every snowdrift along the road. The thought of an American infantryman crouching with a bazooka or a Hellcat suddenly appearing on the flank was enough to break morale before a shot was fired. Veterans later described a strange, gnawing anxiety that followed every movement. The steady hum of an engine once come. In accounts of Panzer campaigns, veterans described recurring nightmares: the sudden blast of a rocket, the roar of a 90mm gun, the helplessness of being trapped in burning steel. These memories often came with bitterness, with humiliation at being defeated by a weapon so simple, so seemingly crude, yet so devastatingly effective. At the same time, there was reluctant admiration for the American ability to combine mass production, thoughtful design, and flawless coordination to create a war machine capable of crushing even elite German forces. Historians later noted that the bazooka and tank destroyer symbolized a broader truth. Wars were no longer won by the mightiest machines alone, but by systemic integration and adaptability. German tankers, once the spearhead of blitzkrieg, were overwhelmed not just by numbers, but by a style of warfare that targeted their weaknesses with ruthless precision. The myth of invincible armor was shattered, giving way to a reality where no tank could advance without fear of sudden destruction. For the soldiers who fought in those armored battles, this realization left scars that outlasted the war. Some never spoke of it, burying the memories with their fallen comrades. Others recorded their experiences, warning future generations that courage and technology mean little against an enemy with ingenuity and resolve. Above all, they acknowledged that the Americans, with their bazookas and tank destroyers, stripped the tank divisions of the aura of invincibility that once surrounded them. This was a sobering legacy, ensuring that the story of German armor in World War II would never be told without the shadow of this small but deadly weapon which stunned even the most battle-hardened crews.